Percé and the French Laundry to Noma and Frantzén. These kitchens are where the world's most elite chefs are made, where the stakes are high, the hours are long, and the pressure is unforgiving. Chef Justin Khanna was in the trenches of them all. He learned the art of fine dining, honed his skills, and rose through the ranks of the world's best kitchens. But what happens when you've tasted the highest level of culinary excellence? When the kitchens you've worked in are legendary, but you realize that there's something more beyond the plate. This isn't just about cooking. It's about the grit that it takes to create a better future, to break free from tradition and build a legacy on your own terms. Today, Justin Khanna is no longer just a chef. He's an entrepreneur, and he's here to tell you how the top kitchens of the world changed everything for him. This is Chef Justin Khanna, and this is the untold side of the culinary world. My name is Chef Ismael, and this is Chef Ismael's Kitchen Quest. Chef, thank you so much for joining me on Chef Ismael's Kitchen Quest. You, just like how we discussed earlier, have made such an impact on my career, both professionally as well as personally, because as we know that being a father while being in the industry can be very difficult. I think this is something that, people like myself have resonated with you in terms of fatherhood. So when it comes down to who Justin Khanna is, I know who you are, but some of my guests might not know, or some of my viewers might not know. But who is Justin Khanna? And just let me know who you are and what you're about.
Yeah. First of all, thanks for having me on. I'm really excited to speak to your listeners and ultimately provide value where I can. I think I even struggle with the putting it in a box in the sense of what is the tagline, what is the title, what is the main little thing that you put underneath my name that can potentially describe me, because I used to, for a long time, go under the title chef because I was working in professional kitchens. I graduated from a prestigious culinary school. I had the degree. I did my time and earned my stripes, so to speak, in doing prep shifts and starting out as a commis and working my way up. And then I kind of pivoted to all of a sudden going into entrepreneurship, where I started hosting pop-ups of my own, and I started to have to wear multiple hats, and I started to have to all of a sudden be worrying about marketing and sales and negotiating and hiring and all of those sorts of elements. And then I launched an even bigger company where I was a co-founder now. That was an interesting title, where I wasn't my business partner was CEO, but I was basically leading a culinary program. And that was its whole other can of worms, where sometimes I would have to be chef and sometimes I had to swap the hat because we had to be on a Zoom call with a client and I had to present something to that person. And then somewhere along the way, like in the restaurant days, I decided that I thought that there was a lot of lessons that I had learned either the hard way, or that the way that I had to learn things could have potentially been improved on in a way that could provide positive impacts throughout the industry, whether that's attracting more people into the industry, causing a little bit less burnout, making sure that people stick with it a little bit longer through some of those tumultuous times. I was managing a kitchen staff at the time, and it was a lot of younger kids coming out of their apprenticeship, coming out of culinary school. And I fundamentally don't think the learning stops for any of us at any one point in time. And I also have this belief that sometimes the best person to teach you is the person who is maybe one or two rungs above you on the ladder. It's very, very difficult to get the person who is at the top of the mountain to come and distill any wisdom to you, because they're so far removed from that place that the empathy can sometimes be gone, or maybe they speak in a little bit too much of a pontificate-y way, where they're saying things like, oh, well, you just need to work hard. Your work ethic is the solution, or you just need to be patient, or something like that. And it's like, I've gotten a little bit too much of that advice, and that made it a little bit difficult for me. So what I did was I decided to start making content, which is another interesting whole can of worms, because then you need to learn about lighting, and you need to learn about audio and camera settings and editing and how to package something up for YouTube or publish on Instagram. And so from a title perspective, it's very, I used to go by chef. I don't think I go by that anymore. I'm more than happy to, address anybody as chef. I am honored when people, call me chef. To kind of also go on your question, I think that there's a little bit of the progression is skewed for a lot of chefs in their careers, because a lot of people get this inbuilt into them when you go from cook to chef at some point in time. And that moment is when you ultimately are either running your own kitchen or you have your own restaurant. And that is the point when you are bestowed this title of chef. And that really messed with me, because I got to a place where I was running a kitchen. I had to run culinary programs. I've been in this place where I've never owned a restaurant, but I've been in this position where, like, for all intents and purposes, all those responsibilities have fallen on my shoulder at one point in time. And none of the chef stuff helped. None of the more recipes weren't going to fix it. Going back to my culinary school and asking for help wasn't going to ultimately get me there. It was the entrepreneurship stuff that really kind of like helped me. It was those insights, reading entrepreneurship books about founders and how they built their companies. That was ultimately what helped me there. And so we can go into that as a philosophy that I have if it's helpful. But to your point, I also have other interests now outside of the kitchen that, like not working 12, 14 hours a day in a kitchen has been able to afford me. I take a lot more care of my health now. I'm sleeping a lot better. As I will ask you advice on the fatherhood thing, because I became a dad 18 months ago. My son's 18 months old, and it's been also a bit of a shakeup to adding that variable into life, becoming a father, and how much that dynamic changes, how much you both are motivated to do more for your family, but at the same time, there's only 24 hours in a day, and your kid gets sick, and now all of a sudden that's a whole wrench in the whole thing. And so yeah, there's multiple identities there. I think that the thing that I spend the most of my time on now is doing a combination of learning, distilling, coming up with frameworks and insights and lessons that I can ultimately pass along, and using that skill I have of kind of like approaching a problem. What are the rules here? How is it being done now? How can it potentially be improved? I love operations, and turning that into something that, again, the market can use, the entire industry at large can leverage to provide better experiences to any sort of element that they interact with. So the staff's onboarding experience potentially being better, the chef's experience of writing a menu being better, and then the guest's experience being better when they finally sit down at that table and they're presented with whatever it is that you're serving to them. And then that leads to all of the other ripple out effects that we have after the fact. They do the word of mouth marketing. They decide to leave you an incredible review. They decide that they want to bring 2 more of their friends with them next time they come and visit you. And then that leads to, like, I spend a lot of time thinking from a philosophy perspective about, like, okay, where does that get us even further than that from like a human consciousness perspective, and just rein it back. And I'm just like, provide great experiences. And it's like, it's maybe okay to stop there. And so again, to not blabber on anymore, that's kind of like, it's hard for me to box it all up, because I just want to do right by the people that I work with, the people that I interact with, the industry folks that are working so hard to, again, provide those experiences. And I want to do it in a way that I feel good about when I look back in 40 years towards the tail end of my career.
So you mentioned experiences. You have had an unbelievable career, from the French Laundry to Noma to, Elenia. Man, you have worked in so many Michelin-starred restaurants. And so I kind of want to go back to your early career. I guess probably even before CIA. I want to know what was a moment in your early career that completely changed the way you look at the culinary industry?
Well, I have some that I can share in a positive light, and then I also can have some negative ones. And for the listener, that might sound like I'm telling horror stories or that I'm complaining, but I think a takeaway for everybody is that, like, you can have moments that you get to choose your response. It's the very stoicism kind of way of approaching things. It's not what happens to you, it's how you respond. And I look at chefs that I've worked for that have been incredibly inspirational, that have taught me a lot about how things can be done, shown me ways of thinking that I had never even been able to hypothesize, and now all of a sudden they're doing it on a day-to-day basis in a consistent way, building their business off the backbone of it. And then I've worked with chefs who I look at that and I say, there's no way I want to be like that in the future. And so I guess, do you want me to tell maybe one of each, or is there one that you'd prefer that I lean on?
Go ahead, give me one of each.
Mm-hmm. So one that I think is a real positive one, we'll start on the positive side of things, is I guess maybe I can tell two here. So the first one is like, when you hear from the outside looking in, if you've worked, for me, it was coming off of culinary school. For others, and that's because I had the immense privilege of being able to work in Thomas Keller kitchens so early. But I think for other folks who might have had a little bit more industry experience, you might be used to something maybe like a seasonal changing menu, or once a quarter chef decides to put a new dish on the menu. And then you hear about Thomas Keller having daily changing menus at his 3 Michelin-starred kitchens, the French Laundry and Per Se. And that is just a total like WTF moment. Like, how are they changing a 9-course tasting menu every single day? And I think in the early days, I would look at that from the sense of their ability to combine flavors in this incredibly dynamic and adaptable way. That was the skill that I thought that I was missing in those early days, because it was like they could take a fish and they could decide that it was going to go with chorizo and spinach and saffron, and then that was going to be the dish that ultimately went on the tasting menu the next day. And they could do that so fast. It was like, it would have taken me 30 minutes to, like come up with that idea. And they were just able to sit at the pass after a 12-hour service at 12:30 in the morning and just spitball that stuff. That was crazy to me. What I came to realize with a little bit of hindsight is the fact that operationally, they had so much infrastructure available to themselves, from the sense of the recipes were so dialed in. They had this great backlog of recipes that made it so that when encountered with an ingredient like sunchokes or fennel or celery root, there was very common, I use the language analogy a lot, where you have a bunch of letters and that might seem like this seemingly disconnected thing, but in the English language, we just have these things called words that are these just unique combinations of letters that you can use to build something like a sentence. And that was just like a big revelatory moment for me, to be able to look at that and see what was required operationally to have a daily changing menu, and to really spend time. I don't often say that I worked at Per Se because I was an extern at Per Se. I didn't get paid for that role. The same thing applies to my time in Alinea and as well as Noma. French Laundry, I worked and got a paycheck and worked there for some time. It was one of those funny things where as you get steeped into it, you start to see that, like, I think this happens with like athletes a lot, where it's like, if you're used to practicing with, your people that you're normally playing with, pick your sport, and then all of a sudden you go to, an NFL combine and you're seeing how they're running plays, or how they're, approaching different exercises, or how they do strength training or something like that. You just see that there's levels to this thing. And that, I think, is like another positive kind of takeaway from one of those experiences. One that I think really influenced my decision, I'm going to switch to the negative side here quickly, is one moment that really made me kind of like pause and really think about the transition from chef to entrepreneur was a experience at a restaurant that I had, where it was probably 6 weeks of work that me and the kitchen brigade entirely did. And all of a sudden we started to kind of like question each other as we looked at our paychecks that we were getting. These used to come in like this white envelope, you'd open it, and then that'd be a check that you had to cash. This was back in like 2011, 2012. And all of us are looking at each other like, is your paycheck kind of low? What's going on? What's going on with this paycheck? It's like, we all of us have been here for 60 hours this week. Like, what is going on with these paychecks being so low? And we all come to realize, like, the restaurant's not paying us overtime. And it wasn't that happened. It was that all of a sudden the word got around, and we sit in the private dining room, all of us chefs, and the executive chef, the owner of the restaurant, comes in and he says, I didn't know that any of you guys were not getting paid. And that was like a big turning point moment for me, where I was just like, man, there are business skills that, because what happened, there was a fallout after that happened. People left, People, started speaking really poorly about that restaurant. And that really showed me that there's like again, talking about there's levels to this. There is a element of business savvy that as we progress through your career and you start thinking about maybe you want to have your own thing, or, you ultimately are tasked with managing the P&L of a place, or you need to start to worry about food cost here. It was like, it's more than just food. And then that ultimately, again, I told myself, if and when I decide to launch a concept, when I'm running the program, when I'm the leader in the organization, I'm not going to have that response of, I didn't know you guys weren't getting, I didn't know we weren't profitable this month. I had no idea that, we didn't pay our purveyor. And that ultimately dictates, like my decision to go into covering industry news on the podcast that I launched, because to the right person, you just so graciously mentioned that you've gotten some value from the content that I've put out over the years. And I think that that's like it's a testament to, if some of these lessons can fall on the ears of somebody who is open to receiving the insight, they can be almost cautionary tales to make it so that we can have a better industry, not from, you having a bad month and face planting and embarrassing yourself and doing all these things. But it's kind of like, it's not even to dunk on the chefs that this happens to. It's just like, guys, this is worth paying attention to. And that's, like ultimately where I think, again, it's positives and negatives. You can have positive role models, people you want to emulate and follow in the footsteps of. And there's a great podcaster named Chris Williamson who has a great anecdote about reverse. He calls them reverse role models. You look at that person and you say, I don't want that person's relationship with their wife. I don't want that person's gambling addiction. I don't want this person's, like maybe they're a little bit too overweight and they're having heart problems in their 40s. Do you know what I mean? Like those are things that like, we can potentially avoid. And your willingness and openness to learn from a wide variety of sources is like a positive forward-looking indicator on how successful you'll be across your career.
Man, that's a crazy story. Luckily I've never had to experience something like that. And, now as a private chef and owner of my business, I literally went back to school to learn the accounting, the marketing, the laws, everything that had to do with business, because there was no way in heck that I was going to be able to not pay my team, to not pay my purveyors. When I go pick up my local produce, that's the first thing I do is I give them the cash, because, and hence why my business has zero debt. And we are just running off of the cash that we have. And, sometimes we have good months, sometimes we have bad months. And so at the end of the day, managing the finances has to be the number one thing, especially when it comes down to running any business. It doesn't matter if it's a restaurant or, a bookstore, whatever it is, finances has to be absolute number one.
And kudos to you for, the best, yes, getting the lesson education from going to school, but you're getting arguably one of the better crash courses in some of these lessons by actually having a business to be able to say, yeah, cool, this case study that was outlined in this book that this professor taught me is one thing, but you're able to actually look at how many events did we do? This client, paid us this and our expenses were that, and my staffing was maybe a little bit too high for this situation. Those lessons, the real rubber meets the road moments, they're so impactful in being able to actually give you evidence that the skills that you are developing actually work. Because, anybody, I have this whole analogy about like, how many books about reading, how many books do I have to read about doing push-ups do I have to learn before I have a, strong chest? You know what I mean? It's like, you got to just do the work sometimes. And so that was point number one. Point number two is like, I can imagine that gives you so much more insight into knowing what to charge for the work that you're doing, because you have some insights into where your costs are going and how much things actually cost. And that, I think, causes a lot of chefs, especially on the private chef side, but restaurant chefs struggle with this too, about they just throw up their hands and they say, I can't raise prices. And it's like, that fear sometimes comes from a lack of knowledge. Like, I'm trying to be empathetic here. I'm trying to look at this like, is the reason that you're scared to raise prices is because you don't actually know where the numbers are flowing in and out of your business. And so I just want to touch on that, because I think that sometimes shining a spotlight on some of those things can take away the fear and make you more likely to, do the behavior that's actually going to move your business forward.
Quick story. I had a client who had asked for some, a fine dining. They wanted to be, they essentially wanted to show to their guests that, what they have done throughout their lives, and they wanted to, indulge in food. And so I presented them the menu, and they said, "Can we have it more?"
Oh, wow.
And I gave it to them, and then they're like, "Let's do a little bit more."
Wow.
So then I'm like, "Okay, well, cool. Now I'm gonna buy white truffle. Not the oil, but the actual truffle. I'm
course,
gonna,
yeah.
you know, get some, like an oyster bar type of thing." And it got to a point where this client was paying around 400 and change per person. And so with that being said, when I got to where I get to a point where I'm starting to charge that, and I'm feeling a little uncomfortable charging that price, because I'm just like, but then I reminded myself what my brother had said. He's a personal trainer, and he says to me, just because you can't afford it doesn't mean that they can't afford it.
100%.
And so I always take that into consideration. Just because I can't afford it doesn't mean that they can't afford it,
It's so true. And I tell private chefs that I work with in a coaching capacity this all the time. I'm so glad you touched on this, because it's just a quick rant that I have that might provide value to somebody listening that's a private chef. Is it's so hard for private chefs. I spent a season when I moved to Seattle. I was doing both pop-up dinners, and then guests at the pop-ups who were well off enough to basically hire private chefs to come to their home, and basically said, "Hey, can you do this pop-up thing, but do a custom menu for us and do it at my house, because I have a penthouse here, I have a lake house on the water, and I would love to invite 12 friends over, and we can do this at my home." And so I know the private chef world reasonably well. And the funniest thing to me about private chefs, myself included, when I was having to think about pricing here, is that we, almost by definition, will never hire a private chef. Because we have the skills. We need to host a dinner party. I'm going to be the one doing the cooking. And so it's very difficult for us to your point, put ourselves in the shoes of the client and say, where's the value here? What's a fair price? You know what I mean? Like all of those sorts of questions, because we look at the situation and we're like, $400, I can just go buy those ingredients for $150 and cook the stuff myself. And that is a horrible place to be at when you're thinking about pricing, because that's not at all how pricing psychology works for being in the market and providing a service. You got to think about how much time are you saving this person? If this person, I've done a ton of these dinners where you ultimately bring people together with the medium of food, me as the chef cooking the menu, because the person who's putting on that dinner surrounds the table with maybe 4 potential hand-picked investors who are going to invest $5 million into their next startup that they're going to launch. And now you're looking at $400 per person, and you're kind of like, you're going to get $5 million off of this dinner alone, and you only had to pay the private chef $4,000 to put this on? It's like, oh my God, what an incredible return on investment. But you as the private chef, you're not thinking in that way when you're starting early on pricing your dinners. And so it's just a very interesting way to navigate that stuff. And I urge the private chefs that I work with to really kind of like, one, absolutely price in a way where you're going to come out ahead in the pricing. Don't price in a way where you're going to lose money on your event. Add buffer pricing where you need to. And then the second thing, like to your point, like how fun is it to work with those clients who have budget available, who are going to tell you to go all out, who are going to tell you they're going to send you the invoice and fully pay it before the event even happens. That's actually a useful framework to use when you're evaluating what clients do I want to take on in my business. And again, this is, like contingent on that's the type of private chef business you want to run. But I definitely kind of like push back onto people who are more apologetic, a little bit more timid, a little bit kind of like they're an ostrich and they bury their head in the sand when it comes to numbers, because those are the entrepreneurs who don't last very long when it comes to any of these ways of participating in the market as a private chef.
Just for the record, if you're ever in California, I'm going to hire you.
100%. I'll jump in wherever you need me.
No, if anything, I'll you lead the way. So working at Michelin star restaurants has had a how do you get it carries its own pressures. So because you've worked in fine dining at the highest level, was there ever a moment you felt like quitting?
Yes, and it happened a couple times. The main and most memorable place where it happened was at the French Laundry, and I'll lay out some of the factors that, depending on where you're at in your career, you might be like, "You dumbass, why did you give up this opportunity?" And for others, if you're in a similar position, it might make total sense because this is exactly speaking to where you're at right now. So I was coming from another Michelin-starred kitchen. This was the one where the pay situation was a little bit wonky. And again, to another lesson that I preach pretty often with people is not to just focus on the recipes you're learning, but also take advantage of the network that you're garnering as you're being in some of these places. We're in the people business just as much as we are in the food business. This restaurant experience was not going that well. I could kind of see the writing on the wall. I didn't really want to spend that much more time at that place. And so I reached out to an old mentor who was the executive sous chef at Per Se, and he was going to be the chef de cuisine. He was getting a promotion to be the chef de cuisine of the French Laundry. And I sent him an email because I had his contact in my address book. And I said, "Hey chef, like I'm really considering potentially a move to the French Laundry. Would you consider, are there any positions available? Would you consider allowing me to come for a stage?" Emails me back, says, "Absolutely." The reason he was able to take my application was because he was kind of like doing a changing of the guard as he came into the chef de cuisine position. The chef de cuisine before him, reputationally, wasn't really running that tight of a ship. And so what he was going to do basically is to kind of toss a wrench into the whole machine, tighten everything up, new recipes, new philosophy on cuisine, new standards, new XYZ. And a lot of people left as part of that. And so what happened was I was part of that class who kind of like came in and was a part of that early rebuilding, team. That it was really positive from the sense that like at the end of my stage, which was again a long day, I think I shucked fava beans for like 3.5 hours or something like that on my stage. We sit down at the end of service and he goes, "You didn't need to come for this stage, right? Like I was going to give you this position, because you were such a good extern at Per Se." Like that was a very, good feeling. Again, talking about like, even when the lesson from that for me is like, even when you don't think that it matters, like still continue to show up and do your best and kind of like try to be, like the professional that you can be in some of those situations, because it ultimately kind of comes back around. I believe that. And so I say yes, I graciously accept the position. I join this team. Basically everybody's new for the most part. And the problem with that is that like anybody who's been a part of a kitchen brigade, in order for you to get promoted, somebody else has to leave. Because it's not like other organizations where, okay, we have a marketing department and you're going from, maybe the sales team and you want to switch to marketing. We'll create another marketing role for you inside of the marketing team so that you can switch. In a kitchen brigade, we're not making another fish station. It's like, no, there's one fish station and there's one guy who's running that station. And the only way you're going to work the fish station is if he moves up to the meat station, he quits, or something else happens where he needs to take leave away. And then the whole brigade basically shuffles around. Very similar to a sports team in that way. And so the problem that I had was I went from commis to working a station. It was a cold station. And all I wanted was to work a hot station. I just wanted to be on the stove in some way, shape, or form. And my managers would have one-on-ones with me and they'd be like, okay, like XYZ has happened over the past 6 months. What are the next 6 months looking like for you from a goals perspective? And every single time I would tell them I want to work a hot station. And because everybody was kind of like new, everybody was getting these promises from the chef de cuisine of kind of like, if you stay for 2 years, you can move up to the fish station. If you stay for 2 years in this position, I'll move you to butcher. If you stay for 2 years, I'll move you up to sous chef. And so all of us were kind of like trapped in this kind of like, we have to stay in our role. We have to be patient. I was in my early 20s and I was impatient. And I was basically like, that almost resentment towards I'm not moving up in the brigade started to drive my performance down, because it was kind of like, why my effort put into this station to, like making things better or being set up for service a little bit earlier or any of those sorts of things is not going to get me closer to my goal. And so then following that ultimately ended up having me perform worse. And then I would get roasted during service. And then, I didn't have the maturity to basically like step above that and say, either I need to move on to another restaurant, or I need to, just gut through it and basically just tell myself that, this will happen eventually as long as you stick with it. And so I got really burnt out. It is really what happened, because again, it was this feeling of like, I'm pushing towards like, there's a great analogy from a YouTuber named Casey Neistat where he defines burnout as a almost disassociation with a finish line. And so it's not the fact, like a lot of us can be incredibly like overworked from the sense that we're putting in 12-hour days, but we don't feel burnout because we know that, we're really pushing towards, I want to have a $20,000 month in my business, or I'm really trying to go for this promotion, or I'm really trying to close this client. It can be really energizing to like work really hard on something. And he talks about this idea of like when the finish line becomes like fuzzy, or you don't even know where the finish line is. You're going through the motions in service of what? That's very demotivating, and that can sometimes lead to burnout. It certainly did for me. And so ultimately I decided that I needed to quit that place, because it was something where I wasn't doing a service to the restaurant, right? Like I wasn't showing up as a good employee, as a good teammate. And I bounced back relatively quickly. I worked at a butcher shop for like 3 months. It was great because I could work a 40-hour week and get a 30-minute lunch break. I thought it was the coolest thing in the world because it was the first job I ever worked where I actually got like a 30-minute lunch break in an 8-hour day. And then again, after those 3 months, it was like I spent 2 months packing up my apartment. And then before I knew it, I was in Norway, in Scandinavia, as a chef de partie there. My first station I worked was on the stove. So I eventually reached my goal. And then 10 months after that, I was promoted to sous chef, because all of those like hankerings that I had towards wanting to just like go, the chains were off, like the leash was off. I was able to actually do that. And then that's what ultimately, like, I'm trying to, make lemonade out of lemons here with this story, to make sure that like I'm sharing that it's okay to kind of like decide that a position is not right for you. You want to make a change. A lot of the stuff that chefs talk about with like tenure at places is largely arbitrary, if we're really being honest. Like what's the difference between working at a place for 10 months versus 14 months? It's like, like that's up for debate. You know what I mean? But I think that there's this common thing where people say like, I told myself I was going to commit here for 3 years. I get emails all the time from people who talk about like, oh, well, chef, I've decided that I'm going to work on the line for 6 years and then I'm going to blank. And it's like a lot of that stuff is completely arbitrary. My career is certainly a testament to that. And again, I push people to, again, we pour so much of ourselves into our work, and the job requires us in a lot of ways to show up as our best self. And if something is in the way of that, I find that addressing it can ultimately make it so that it frees you up to do your best work, which I think all of us want from a fulfillment perspective when we think about the jobs that we're taking.
That's a very interesting. That's very interesting how the French Laundry works. I would have, man, I would have like loved to have that opportunity as well, to work at the French Laundry. But that's a strange way, that the way they run it, because if you're at the fish station, that's where you're at, and you don't move. But in other restaurants that I've worked in, whether it was a QSR or casual dining or fine dining, one of the things that the chef likes to do is to cross train.
Sure.
And the reason is because if an emergency happens, they're able to, jump in, or, vacation, cool, jump in, whatever the reason is, right? And so And that's one thing that I've always implemented in my kitchens is, one works the line or the expo, one works grill or whatever, saute, any station that I put them on. Is there a reason why the French Laundry didn't work that way?
Yeah, part of it I think is back to my point I made on operations, because there are so many. You'll spend a week training on fish station, just shadowing a person before they'll let you work service by yourself, basically. And so the way that a training week might work is the way that the brigade is structured. If we're talking about fish station as the example, canapé station comes before that. And so if you're on canapé and you're getting promoted to fish station, you'll do a training week where the first 2 days is literally just you side by side with the fish station person, shadowing them and basically maybe helping out with their mise en place. And you literally just stand there during service. Maybe that's day 1. Day 2, you'll maybe like assemble garnish trays for them. Day 3, maybe they're letting you kind of like in the slow points of service, you'll do a couple of the pickups. And part of that is because if you've ever read any of the anecdotes on like Grant Achatz working at the French Laundry, that Michael Rollman in some of his books outlined, he basically outlines like the number of dishes that Grant was responsible for, because Thomas Keller puts, in his brigades, and I guess it's more the chef de cuisines of these places because Chef Keller isn't, there on the day-to-day anymore. But it is one of those situations where there's an immense amount of trust put in any of those individuals on those stations. So much so that there are stories of like when I was working at Per Se, if any of the meat chef de partie, like there's one meat chef de partie, and they do all of the, like the lamb and the Wagyu and all of those proteins for the tasting menu. And if you overcook the Wagyu, you got sent home. It was just as simple as that. It was a ruthless from the sense of like high standards, a lot of trust put on you and your execution. And I think a lot of that attracted people like myself to being able to say, I want to have my skills well developed enough so that the chef de cuisine trusts me to run the station. That's a lot of the reason why, I think people roll their eyes sometimes when they see Chef Keller going into the kitchen and fist bumping people and say, hey, chef, he calls you chef because it is a chef de partie position. You are the chef of the station. You run it as if it's your own little mini restaurant. And these are an expression of your ability to keep those standards high, your ability to organize your mise en place and keep track of your accounts and all those things. That's what influenced me to be like the way that I am. And so like to your question, it's like the cross training is difficult. One, because you don't really have the time because you're so, like pulling your hair out trying to make the daily changing menu happen on your own station. So it's not like you really have that much time. I spent a couple of days cross training maybe on canapé station because I had the ability to get my station set up early. And then I, like timidly wander over to the stove and I basically ask the canapé person a couple of questions and they say, yeah, come in, jump in and help me with this thing, which I was very grateful to receive that time. But it is almost like the philosophy is almost kind of like, why would I teach you how to do this? Because there's no world where you're going to jump in. If any of those situations that you outlined, the person cuts their finger, they burn their arm, they get sick, their family needs them, there is a sous chef or a tournant who would jump in and work that station first. Because in order to become a sous chef at any of these places, you need to have worked every single station in the brigade so that you have an in-depth understanding about a lot of the standards that go into, like how to cook the pomme maximes, which are these like little potato chips that go on top of, individual dishes, how to drop the lobster in the sous vide butter bath, how to, cook the Wagyu over the Binchotan grill station. And it's one of those funny things where it's not like you can kind of just like, it's almost, the timing is also important, right? Where it's like, the way that the tasting menu flows, because you're running this station as if it's in your own mini little restaurant, it's kind of like an order gets called out and there's almost like a movement flow that kind of like takes shape the second that an order comes in. And it works very similar to muscle memory. I love the athlete example here where it's like the quarterback calls a play and exactly what your movements need to be after, the ball gets delivered to that quarterback. You know what I mean? It's like there's that symphonic movement makes it so that a relatively small team, right? Like there's only 5 real stations at the French Laundry on the hot side. right? So it's like there's cheese, which is like the cheese station, that course. A lot of the canapes, like the salmon cornets, come off of that station. The canape station, fish station, meat station, entremet station, and then it's like per se has a garde manger station that runs, but it's like for all intents and purposes at the French Laundry, entremet and garde manger kind of like got combined, and so it's like they can do 120 people at the French Laundry with 5 cooks and 2 sous chefs, a 9-course tasting menu, and there's pastry as well. But it's like that efficiency is only allowed when you have literally a team of savages who are the ones behind the stove. And so it's not to discredit any sort of other operation. I went, I totally bucked 3 Michelin star land when I moved to Scandinavia because I went to a place where the Michelin guide didn't even have a representation there. And so I've worked across all different spectrums of restaurants too. I just think in the context of TFL and per se, the way that it's structured makes it very difficult to have any of that, and there's also a status thing, man. Like if I'm really just being honest, it's kind of like you needed to earn, you know what I mean? Like the right to work fish station. And because of that, if we're really kind of like being honest here, the fish guy was almost like protective of his role in the fish station. And that you often see in sports too. You know what I mean? If you're on the varsity team, you're not really going to have the JV person come over and train with you because you know that if that JV person gets good enough, they're going to take your spot. And so there's a little bit of that dynamic too that's going on that I think sometimes gate kept some of the progression that I personally didn't really like, because I'm very similar to yourself. Like I wanted the ability to just be able to wander over and say like, hey, can I cook a piece of fish now? Like I don't have anything else happening on my station right now. Can you show me? And it's not to say that didn't happen, because I learned a ton from, staying after. When I was an extranet per se, I would stay after for 2 hours, and my sous chef was making the foie gras torchons, and I was just like, hey, can I ask you some questions about foie and just watch you, while you're doing this? And that was acceptable because I was an extern. I didn't have a station. All my jobs were done for the day and everybody else had gone home. And so I just want to stay after and learn. That's acceptable. But when you're running a station, it's just like you're so underwater. You have so many other responsibilities. It's difficult to kind of like have that cross-pollination happen as much as you would maybe want.
Man, I mean, we could have an entire conversation on this. We gotta have a part 2 to this.
Yeah, I'm an open book. And I don't think I'm giving away any sort of like
secrets,
proprietary IP here when it comes to some of these places. I'm also like, I will be as transparent and real about these experiences as I will praising and congratulating and giving flowers, because I think there's a common thing to kind of like poo-poo high performance because it is ruthless. It is sometimes negative. There is a little bit of gatekeeping that happens here. But I think the reason a lot of us look up to Thomas Keller as a chef is kind of like, we don't even need to get into it. You know what I mean? Like in a lot of ways, he's the GOAT. And so you kind of like, I will look back at my career in, again, 30 years, 40 years, being able to say that I was hopefully able to accomplish some great things on the restaurant side. But at the same time, like I constantly ask myself that question. There's this tension in my soul around, can you build high caliber organizations without hurting anybody? And I think that question fundamentally is like, so many of our generation is kind of like thinking about that. And I think that's one of the reasons why I try to cherry pick things in a thoughtful way, because you want to do things that makes people push themselves almost to kind of like drive a little bit of that kind of like hunger and the desire to perform. But at the same time, you almost want to like suck any of the negativity and toxicity and name calling and berating out of the system to create a productive culture. Again, could do a whole podcast on that too, but I wouldn't even call it a love-hate relationship with that experience. It's more with the benefit of hindsight and being removed from fine dining kitchens for as long as I have been. I think I can look back on it not in a resentful way. I don't resent my time in any of these kitchens that a lot of people talk about having trauma from these experiences and any sort of that. Like, if that's you, like, I hope that you have the ability to kind of like work through some of those things. But I look through it from the sense of, what can I learn from this? What are some of the positives and negatives, labeling them in a way that is like not gaslighting myself and really actually becomes useful so that I can be a productive member of the next generation for the industry.
Yeah, I like that because you are taking the Gary Vee approach where you want to be able to grow, but
Honey
do
Empire.
yes, so do it on a ethical and positive manner, right?
Totally.
Because our industry is very cutthroat.
Yeah.
A lot of egos, a lot of just like how you mentioned, protectiveness. I had no idea that the French Laundry was running that way. But I again, like, man, like I that's like one thing I do regret personally as a professional, is that I wish I knew I wanted to do this earlier in my life. And so the opportunities could have been completely different for me, but it is what it is, and we all take our journeys the way, it was intended to be, right? So I want to talking about Gary Vee as well. I want to talk about building a brand and entrepreneurship,
Yeah.
just a little bit here.
Yep.
Um, so you transitioned from working Michelin-starred kitchens to building your own brand. What's something that chefs don't realize about entrepreneurship?
That it's a learnable, it's a skill set that you can learn more about these. You can develop these, and the first time you try something mirrors a lot more closer to some of your early days in kitchen land than you would initially think. And chefs, bless their hearts, will be one of the first people to say, "Oh yeah, the first time you slice an onion, you suck at it. You're slow, you might cut yourself, you realize that your knife maybe wasn't as sharp, you're holding it wrong, you don't have anything under your cutting board, so it's slipping all over the place." And then they'll say that out of one side of their mouth, and then on the other side they'll say, "Oh well, the first time I had to build a website, it didn't really work for me." Or the first time I tried to run Facebook ads, didn't really work for me. Or the first time that I decided to hire for a role, it didn't really work for me. And so I went back to deciding that I am the only one in my business who can cook the food. There's a great book called The E-Myth Revisited, which I highly recommend every single chef who has any ambition to want to step into the entrepreneurship role read. And the reason it's such an illuminating book is because the subject that he uses for the book, which has rippled out into Silicon Valley and all sorts of business circles. It's not a book written for chefs, but the subject that he uses to case study in the book is a baker. It is a woman who bakes pies. And the whole premise of the book is basically like, she decides that she doesn't want to call herself an entrepreneur because she's a baker. I bake the pies. I'm the only one who bakes the pies. Nobody can bake as well as I can. And therefore, I'm going to poo-poo all of these things that could ultimately help me to grow a business. And it's a really fascinating book because it is the author basically coaching this baker through this process of learning about these skills, understanding why they're important, and really flipping her beliefs around. You can change these things. You can learn about these things, and it's going to allow you to do the things that you want to do with the product that it is that you sell, which is your pies. And so like anything that I'm going to spout is going to reference a lot of great entrepreneurship material that I've learned, but like that was one pivotal book that really changed things for me. And so that's like the first step, is acknowledging that like these are not things. Like, I hear language from chefs all the time about like they throw up their hands and they say, "I'm not a numbers guy." And why do they say that? They say that because they got a D- on an algebra paper in middle school at one point in time. Or they got asked to run the numbers on an event and they totally screwed it up, and it didn't go well. Or they tried to build a spreadsheet one time and XYZ thing happened and it wasn't for them. And so that self-talk, those beliefs that you have, ultimately dictate your ability to show up and continue to improve any of these skills. Because there's another aphorism in entrepreneurship, which is like, there's no such thing as a skill called business, right? We look at business and you can actually toggle it open and expand it into all of these other pillars that make up. And again, you can take any of those, dial them down even further and identify their skills underlying all of these behaviors. That you pick the chef that you admire, you pick the business that gets you excited, you pick the person that you're pointing to and say, I want that. It's like there's skills underpinning all of those things. There's a reason I call my education company Repertoire, because that's what I believe when it comes to how chefs should progress through their career. There's not going to be one moment or one recipe that's going to like do it for you. It's going to be this collection of skills and experiences and your network and this thing the chef taught you and this YouTube video you watched at 2 a.m. and your notes that you took while you were at some conference about building a website. And all of those things together increases your capacity and your ability to actually serve in the market. And so that's the first thing that I want to just, again, get chefs to really wrap their head around. And then really think about when you went from cook to chef, there were certain kind of like things that you understood that were going to take some time, and you had some patience about them, and you asked thoughtful questions, and you had somebody, you maybe looked like a little bit of an idiot when you did it the first time, but you had a mentor come over and show you, and you just decided like, okay, I'm going to spend XYZ amount of time on this station until I finally have this down. That I think is like one of the bigger things. And then 2, just kind of like be thoughtful about how you're building it and what you're building it for, I think is like the next thing when it comes to like, to your question about building a brand and entrepreneurship. It's like, I wanted to make content in the very, very early days. I wanted to make content that would have appealed to and would have helped Culinary School Justin, which if I were to put a label on it was a ambitious, young, hungry, I just want help. And I just want to do this the right way. I want to save time. I don't want to waste time. I want to show up as my best self. I want opportunities. I want to be able to sit across from a chef and not get rejected. I don't want to say the wrong thing. And so that influenced a lot of the content that I make in the early days, which in entrepreneurship circles is the scratch your own itch advice that a lot of the, advice giving entrepreneurs or authors will tell you when you're building your first product. If we're talking about traditional entrepreneurship, is make something that helps one person. Because a lot of people build brands in a way that they do it in a way that they think that's what people want, or they think that's maybe what would be cool, or they just have a hunch that might work. Whereas if you can just focus on, I'll bring it back to the private chef example for someone like yourself. It's like, can you get one client? Can you write a menu that's going to appeal to one client? Because as much as we like to think that like everybody's their own special snowflake, it's kind of like if you can make content that's going to appeal to you, or at least one person that you're maybe serving in the market, chances are there's more people, there's concentric circles around that ultimately make it so that you can get a critical mass of people. Kevin Kelly calls this 1,000 true fans framework, where you don't actually need hundreds of thousands or millions or tens of millions of followers in order to have quote unquote success in whatever it is that you're doing. You just need to ultimately do something that is going to appeal to people that get like rabid about your stuff. Do you know what I mean? Like it's a great signal for me to jump on a call like this and have you sing like such gracious praise to the work that I've done for you. And it's like, that lets me know that I'm doing something right. Versus this big amalgamation of people I've built, let's say I built 1 million followers, but everybody's just kind of like, Justin's whatever. Justin's fine. Like he said some things, but he's kind of just parroting other people. It's like, that is just a completely different way of building a business. It's not to say that people can't find success doing it. We see it all the time. But I think for the founders, the people who really want to kind of like build something, I think that advice maybe has just like served me well. And I just want to make sure that people keep that in mind so that they don't build a business that is ultimately like a prison of their own making. And now they have to sleep in this bed that they aren't even that excited about, because that leads to a lot of this other like short-term behavior of like cutting corners or making promises that you can't, uphold, or any of those sorts of things.
Yeah, no, it's I mean, you just now you just again taught me something. I'm here thinking because I got about what 12,400 something followers, right?
Yeah.
And it's like as of today
Mhm.
on the 31st of January. Um, and I'm thinking, okay, yeah, like I gotta continue to uh grow in order for me to get more clients, but that's not really the case because you do make a great point. I do have a pop-up coming up on Valentine's Day, and I, was fortunate enough to finally partner up with the restaurant to help me out with this. And
Amazing.
not only am I getting new followers with that, but also I'm appealing to the local uh, population in terms of a pop-up that's affordable, but also more of a private ticketed event where they can get that fine dining experience, right? So that I think, man, I really like the way you explain that. Um, I do have a scenario question for you.
Sure.
If you had to restart from scratch today, no money, no network,
Mm,
what's the first thing you do to build a successful career?
hmm. Great question. Um, so a thing that really helped me in the early days was coming up with a basically set of horse blinders for myself and my career. It found me from the sense that I needed to get exposure to enough examples of success in the industry for me to ultimately land on this. And where it ultimately came from was the first time I read the Alinea cookbook. And I looked at Grant's story and his ability to kind of like take a set of experience from growing up in Michigan and then going and working at the French Laundry, staging at El Bulli, and then going to Chicago to open 3 Michelin starred Alinea. And I basically said, I grew up in Wisconsin. It wasn't really like that much of a gastronomic hub when it comes to food. But I said, I would love to be able to also go back to the Midwest. I didn't really have that much of a connection to New York or California, which were at the time, the majority of the Michelin restaurants were concentrated to those cities. And I could go and open up a 3 Michelin starred restaurant in Chicago. And once I set that as the goal, it allowed me to make decisions in my career because, especially early on in your career, it is absolutely a series of decision tree, fork in the road moments. Am I going to go to school or am I not? Am I going to, go for, like the fine dining kitchen right away? Or am I going to go to the casual place first and then like ladder my way up? I now all of a sudden have 2 job offers from 2 different restaurants. Which one do I choose? Any of those questions, I had the immense privilege of being able to kind of take those, look at them and say, which one is going to get me closer to a 3 Michelin star restaurant in Chicago? And that framework was really, really helpful for me in ultimately being able to say, yes, I do want to go to culinary school. Yes, I do want to do the staging that's required for me to ultimately make it so that when I get my externship, it is at a Michelin star restaurant, ideally a 3 Michelin starred one. And then again, all of those questions after the fact. And all of my other friends would chase other things. Oh, you're going to go work at Per Se for your externship and you're going to pick herbs for 8 hours a day. I got an offer from a country club and they're going to let me go work the grill there. So like big middle finger to you because I'm cooler than you because I'm, working the grill and I'm working with steak all night and I have the fire and the flames and look how cool I am. And you're just picking herbs all day. You don't know how to do anything and look at how capable I am. Or I just got this offer to go work on a yacht and they're paying $105,000 a year for me to this is my first job out of culinary school. Look at how cool I am because XYZ things. I was able to keep the patience, keep the persistence, keep the focus because any of those things was just kind of like, it's so easy to say no to that because I've committed to myself that it's not going to get me closer to this goal that I have. So that's number 1. Number 2 is this thing that like I don't know if this is a temperament thing. I hope when I say this, it's coming off and like providing the right amount of a push to the right person as I share this. But it's very difficult to substitute for experience. It's very hard. The stories that I'm going to share on these podcasts, the insights that I share on my YouTube channel, you reading a bunch of different books on things, as I've kind of shared with the finance example, as you're talking about learning entrepreneurship skills, it's very difficult to substitute for, I worked service, I did a catering function, I worked a private event, I had to change the tasting menu on the fly, I had to make an allergy modification, I dropped an entire tray of something and I need to redo it and service started 7 minutes ago. Oh my goodness, what am I got in a fight with my station partner and we're not communicating well. How do I overcome this? And so I have that tension that I have when I'm creating educational products where I try to make them in an adaptable way so that they can be taken alongside real world experience, because I'm so bullish on it. I just truly believe that the people who ultimately end up being really successful leaders, stick with the industry the longest, really kind of like craft amazing experiences in the concepts that they ultimately create or the brands that they build, are the ones who have a little bit of that kind of like experience kind of baked into it. So I'd keep both of those two things in mind: is developing a focus, prioritizing a real world experience. And then the third one is this kind of like analogy I've been kind of like kicking around. I've been sharing it on other shows that I've been going on recently. I don't necessarily know if this is the right analogy to make, but I'll share it here again. Is the idea of some sort of name recognition, or the way that I'm kind of phrasing it is like a card that you can use in the market to trade with people. And so I knew that when I got that card from Per Se saying, you know, you did your externship here, what can I trade that for in the market? When I take this to my next restaurant in the form of my resume, when I hand this to that restaurant, when they look at that and they see the name of a Thomas Keller restaurant on the resume, it is going to be worth something in the market without knowing how do I have the ability to work clean? What is my temperament? You know what I mean? Do I have the ability to move in a kitchen? It's almost like you have this ability to ride the coattails a little bit of some other stand on the shoulders of giants, so to speak, when you're moving about your career, when you prioritize. And some people will call it like chasing clout or just kind of like going for the name recognition. And there's absolutely ways where people use and abuse this, right? You go, spend 2 weeks at a place in Scandinavia, and then all of a sudden you're touting that like you worked at Noma. You know what I mean? I'm so cautious to say those things, because it's like there's an immense difference between staging somewhere and truly kind of like working a station, not even from how the industry looks at it and how people will perceive you, but the genuine skills you develop there. Because when you're a stage, you have no accountability requirements. You have no responsibility on your shoulders. If you don't show up tomorrow, nobody basically cares. But to the point that I was talking about earlier, when you are the chef of the station, you will learn a ton through a lot of those lessons that are just kind of like thrust upon you when you're in that role. And so to me, it's like, I don't necessarily know if I would do anything different. But those questions of, is this allowing me to get real world experience? Do I have a core focus that's going to make it so that I know how to navigate the decision points in my career? And am I associating myself with with a amalgamation of people where there's a certain level of kind of like, it's almost like a little boost you get. You're going to be spending 12 hours a day in these kitchens anyways. You might as well do it at a place where you go to your next place, or to your, like, I'll maybe just share an anecdote for me. It's like, I did a pop-up right before my son was born here in Seattle. And the landing, it was a pop-up series. So it was, I think, 4 chefs in the Seattle area, and we all got put on the landing page together, right? So like all of us were doing a pop-up. It was through this venue who was basically wanting to do a chef series. My pop-up sold out the fastest because the first line of the description of my thing was Justin Khanna from the French Laundry experience. Do you know what I mean? Experience in Scandinavia, experience with all these other things. They hadn't had my food yet. A lot of these people didn't know who I was. But because I had that card of I have worked at this place, it allowed that person, like, I think I charge also more than other people did because I was doing a longer tasting menu than most people were doing. Because that's just like where I lean. That's where my preference is when I'm cooking a tasting menu. And so it's like, I look at that and I say, yeah, you sacrificed a lot in the long days and the, like maybe negative experiences you had, but it's providing a return on your investment from that time. Because now, again, I sold out the fastest. I knew that my event had sold out and I made higher profit margins because I was able to, again, kind of like have a little bit of that name recognition. And so I have like, a love-hate relationship with the thing because you'll see somebody, and I totally get this. I had the same problem with Lysverket, the restaurant in Norway that I worked at. For all intents and purposes, nobody knows who the fuck Christopher Hottuft is, what Lysverket is, what type of food that they do. I learned more at that restaurant than probably the 3 restaurants prior combined because it was also a very small team. I held a management position there. I got to make a lot of the decisions when it came to the menus. That's the restaurant where I started making content at. But it doesn't hold the same weight in the market being able to tell somebody, because like I used to try to lead with that in interviews like this, or when a journalist would reach out and say, hey, Chef Justin, you're hosting a pop-up. Can I get a little bit of a blurb to put in our newspaper or magazine to promote your pop-up? And I would say, oh, my experience is coming from this restaurant in Norway called Lysverket. And people are like, where is that? Have you worked anywhere else? And then I say, oh yeah, before that I was at the French Laundry. And they're like, cool, I'm going to run with that. Do you know what I mean? And then that's what they decide to write about. And so it was this very funny thing of like, I just had firsthand experience of that, of yes, I got more out of experience at this one restaurant, but the market responded better towards this name that they had recognition from and they could draw an association from. And I think that's just how humans are. You know what I mean? Like we're mimetic creatures. We like to copy things that we've heard before and follow along with others more so than maybe making our own decisions. And so doing the combination of those 3 is kind of like, I wouldn't do much different, but I think those are the things that I would thinking about. I think maybe underneath your question, and correct me if I'm wrong here, is like, would I maybe think about doing content alongside? Yes, I think. I'm the type of person who like, it's very difficult for me to document the things that I'm learning about in the moment. I find that I'm much more effective if we think about the landscape of your career as like these series of little mountain peaks. I don't like talking about whatever I'm hiking up. I like getting to the top of that thing, looking back, seeing a bunch of other people coming towards me and offering them advice as they're coming, up the mountainside. And that if you look back, that's what I've basically been doing when it comes to working the line. It's basically been like, I reached a place where I was kind of like, I felt super comfortable coming up with frameworks, felt super comfortable with my experience. I felt like I had a place of authority to speak from. I had done it for almost a decade. And I felt comfortable enough being able to turn around and help the other people who are coming up that side of the mountain. You'll notice now that I've been in business since like, I've owned my own business since 2017. And so now like the YouTube channel launched, I think in like 2014, 2015. I didn't really consider it a business at that time because I was still working as a sous chef. I was barely lucky enough to be able to kind of like bring a camera into the kitchen that I was cooking at. But it's like only now, 8 years into owning my own business, do I feel comfortable at least being at a place where I've run a profitable business for, an extended several years now in a row. I've hired and fired employees. I've had to come up with products that I've had to sell in multiple different capacities, menus, digital products, selling sponsorships to people. Only now do I feel comfortable kind of like doing those sorts of things. And so I think if anything, what I would feel better about in those early days of my career is like, I just wish I had more content, man, from those days. I just wish I had the ability to like, maybe even if I didn't publish it, I sometimes give that advice to chefs that I work with, of even if you don't decide to publish it, if you have any inkling of wanting to, like have some sort of legacy or share some insights into what you've learned along the way, it is so valuable to have the right after service. Maybe you had a bad day, set your camera up and just rant at the camera for 3 minutes. Or like take a time lapse of you on your first day on Garde Manger station, setting up for service. because I don't have any of that content. One part of it is because the cameras and smartphones weren't at the stage that they are now back in the day. And so I didn't have the tools. And two, I didn't have I didn't know that I was going to launch a YouTube video or a YouTube channel, 7 years into my chefing life. And so it was very difficult for me to foresee that. But I think now we're starting to see people who are like on day one, I would argue even like too early, maybe putting out content from an authority perspective. I think the other framework that really helps people when it comes to this is Alex Hormozy's framework around when you're putting out content. If you feel a little bit too early or you feel like you're going to get ostracized by the industry, you can talk about how as opposed to how to. So here's how I set up my station, not here's how to set up your station. Because if you're a 22-year-old who's, working the hot app station somewhere, who's going to listen to you when you're saying, here's how to set up your station on the hot apps section? It's very difficult because you don't have that inbuilt level of authority yet. But here's how I set up my hot app station. Nobody can argue with that, right? Because you're just telling the truth. You're stating the facts and telling the truth. And so, again, could I potentially have, built another, if I started today, I could start a, Instagram account or YouTube channel and blow up a little bit faster. Sure. But I think that when I really think about my ability to kind of really impact people, it comes from some of those other three things that I touched on.
I could definitely see your point on the name aspect of things, right? On my resume, Disneyland is there, right?
Yes.
When you see Disneyland, you think of the epitome of what hospitality is all about. And me receiving that training on the 4 keys at the time, right? Which was safety, efficiency, courtesy, and show. And I still remember them because I embedded them in my mind. And moving forward to whether I was working at another restaurant or even now running my own business, I make sure that I still run with those 4 keys in my business. And who's going to argue with Disney? Nobody.
That's right.
They are a mega company and hugely successful. So why not try to implement what they're doing into your business?
Totally.
So I do have a controversial culinary question, which I usually like to ask.
No, that's fun.
So with all of your experience in fine dining, do you believe that fine dining today is more about storytelling or is it more marketing than actual food? And I ask this because, in my opinion, I think we're at a point where chefs are prioritizing Instagram over flavor. And I've seen too many food reviews or restaurant reviews where they say, great marketing, food looks great, but the taste isn't there.
I love this question. It is an idea that I'm going to repeat ad nauseum, I think, in 2025. It is something where I sent out my first newsletter on this last week. So it was an idea I'm super high on, which is this idea that experience is everything. And this is no bash on the Disney premise or pillar in the word show, but I am using, I think you can correct me if I'm wrong, how they use the word show in context when it comes to how they think about either menu or delivering an experience or the hospitality that they provide. But I do think that there is an element of putting experience and show, or experience and flair maybe, on two ends of the spectrum, and being able to, again, it's not a binary thing, because you might have an incredible SOM experience or front of house, is talking to you and teaching you about the thing, but then you sit down and they do the smoke dome that is just kind of really flashy, or they have the dry ice that's coming out of the bowl and the dessert is just really lackluster from that perspective. And so that's where the idea of experience is everything comes from for me, which is all of the prepping and sourcing and deciding and staffing and all of these things, they funnel towards this thing that is the experience that the guest has at the place. And then everything that comes after, that ripples out from that experience, do they tell their friends about it? Was it profitable? Does this allow you to get the awards that you want to get? Stem from the quality, again, how good is that experience? And so what I think you're seeing in some of these places is when you have to make a video for Instagram, you're basically only appealing to a certain number of senses. Our sense of smell and our sense of taste cannot be transmitted through an Instagram video or an Instagram photo. And so you can make the most colorful, most, like blowtorching the thing, having smoke coming out of it thing. But it comes back to one of the principles that I talked about, which is like, do you have the real world experience to actually season this with enough salt so that, like I've had way too many disappointing meals where the flare and the flash, I have a video on the channel if anybody wants to watch it. I went to this restaurant called Kin in Boise, Idaho. A ton of show went into that restaurant experience. But like little things like not dressing the greens that went on one of the dishes or putting flavors together that just didn't, work from that perspective. Or they leaned a little bit too hard into like, they brought people out to like sing tableside as part of the experience. Or they named some of the dishes as a thematic thing with superstition was the, like theme of the dinner. And so every single dish had this like rabbit's foot or like step on a crack and break your mama's back, was the name of the dish. And the experience sucked. And so like in one way, I think part of what I'm trying to do as I keep this philosophy top of mind for myself is doing a better job of defining what is a good experience. When I tell people improve the experience, what do I mean by that? I think doing a little bit more frameworking around what does that mean? Because I think you can go a little bit too heavy-handed in doing that, where you're creating this almost like robotic execution on things, and there's no, like we're sucking the human element out of it. But I think it's doing the other side of it is basically throwing our hands up and saying, well, it's all arbitrary, and like people will make their own decisions. I think to something you had mentioned earlier, it's like keeping in mind the caliber or the taste of the person evaluating some of these experiences on Instagram is also really important to keep in mind. Because I have so many friends who like, I call them friends, they're more acquaintances, who basically like will go and have go to a restaurant that invites them to an influencer thing. And again, you phrase this as a controversial question, so I'm going to go a little bit spicy and controversial here, where it's like they go to one of these influencer dinners and they've never had, you know what I mean, like a actually good, French bistro experience before. And so they've never been to Paris, for example. And this is their first time having, a Petivier that is going to be presented tableside and, like any of these things. And it's like you can insert whatever thing. And so just the fact of it was shaken in a glass and then poured out, or it has the dry ice, or it has the smoke, or again, it was served tableside on a cart. That ends up being the like, oh my God, this was so good. It was so cool. Like it was so whatever. And their ability to actually evaluate the experience is not up to snuff with actually being able to clearly articulate what is good and what is not. This is the difficult thing. This is the reason why Rick Rubin, who is like the legendary music producer, memes get making about basically making fun of him, dunking on him, because he's the guy who basically like can sit in the studio with Pharrell or System of a Down, and he can say, I think you should think about changing the beat on this, or I think you should kind of like just sit with yourself. And he talks about taste a lot in his writing. He talks about creativity a ton. And it is this kind of like difficult to define, capturing lightning in a bottle, moments that I'm really trying to work on in my framework mind of kind of like trying to come up with some of these things that I can use to help people. But with the chefs that I work with on a coaching capacity, that can sometimes be a helpful question that helps them to make the decision that needs to be made. Because to your point, what's going to get me views on Instagram might be another fluid gel. Let's get the smoking gun out. Let's put it on the cart and serve it tableside. Let's serve it for two. So it's this big flashy thing that kind of like hits the table and oh my goodness, it's this whole thing. But when I ask my chefs, it's like, what would improve the experience? They pause and they typically know exactly what to do. Because especially if that person has eaten out enough and they've, done enough cooking across a wide range of menus throughout the seasons for enough different chefs, they look at that and they know exactly what to do. I had a chef the last chef that I worked for, who I brought up, named Christopher Hatuft. He talked a lot about really putting trust in people who had been well eaten in their careers. Because we had a guy who was working the pastry station, and we combined the cheese course on the tasting menu with the pastry courses at the menu in the restaurant on the menu. And the chef de partie was like pretty green in his career. He had, hadn't been in the industry for that long. And with a VIP table, he sent out a piece of cheese just straight from the fridge. And for those that don't know, a typical practice, especially in France, is to temper the cheese, because as ingredients are colder, it's more difficult for our palates to pick up on individual nuances when it comes to aroma and the way that, like individual flavors hit our taste buds. You can see this sometimes if you've ever had like a red wine served cold versus a red wine served at like room temperature. You can sometimes pick up on flavors a little bit easier when the wine is warmer. You'll sometimes notice that. And he looked at this person's execution on their station, and he was like, I was expediting at the pass that night, and he was like, you need to go tell this person that like they need to, on their day off this weekend, they need to go eat at this restaurant who does their cheese courses immaculately well, because that will teach them the lesson of being able to actually evaluate food and learn this lesson that we have. And like, that's why I think the repertoire analogy is so interesting, because I can tell you that data point on cheese, that does not give you the ability to open a high performance, restaurant or an award-winning restaurant tomorrow. It is like, you need to calculate the number, right? Like, you need to have 800 more experiences just like that until you get to the place where you can even start to think about evaluating food on a way. And like, I approach my going out to eat videos that I publish on my channel. You were grateful enough to have stumbled upon the French Laundry video that I posted. That's why I publish those videos, is not to flex that I went to this tasting menu. I'm learning in every single one of those meals that I go out to eat at. I'm getting better at being able to evaluate food because I'm having experiences in the real world context. It's not like I'm, ordering peaches and I'm sitting at the table and I'm trying to like dissect, what am I eating? I'm getting it in a composed dish, and I'm getting it served to me, and I'm getting the person talk to me about it, and I'm getting the garnish that goes with it, and I'm getting the wine pairing served alongside it. And then there's a little bit of that, just like, it just adds a little bit of a notch in my belt where I now can have a reference point that I can use to kind of compare across some of these things. So I guess to kind of sum it up, it's kind of like, people can have incredible marketing and hype, and I think some of that is fed into by more social proof from people who don't get it. They just don't have the I don't even know, like, you can help me with some language here if anything comes to mind. It's just like, they haven't eaten out enough. They're too easily impressed. The little flashy things gets them excited more so than the substance of whatever the chef decided to put on the plate. And it almost creates this like negative, you know what I mean? Like feedback loop where I post the thing with the smoke dome that gets me 10,000 views. Therefore I need to do more of that. That leads all the influencers to want to come eat at my restaurant. They're posting about me doing the smoke dome thing. And everybody's like missing the fact that like you can't even cook your protein properly. And so I think that causes like, again, this negative spiral where we kind of like, we lose the plot through all of this flash and flare, unfortunately.
You're absolutely right. I have the same thoughts about that, because I used to have I had a friend who would tell me, oh, this video game's so good, or this movie's so good. Then you go watch it and you're like, dude, what kind of taste do you have, bro? Like,
Totally.
Um, and to me, I'm just like, you're right, man. When it comes down to the tasting, that's exactly what I do every time I go to, whether it's a Michelin star restaurant or to a mom and pop restaurant, a hole in the wall, is I I dissect and I try to learn from the lessons from it. What could I have done differently? What could or what can I implement into my cuisine? And I think that's extremely important that as chefs, we do that and we're continuously learning.
I just really wanted to interject for one quick second. I'm so glad you brought up the different, like both of those different styles of concept, because I think any of us can agree that you can go to a hole in the wall sports bar and have an incredible burger and fries and a beer. You can go to a ramen place that is, it's one guy and 6 counter spots. You can go to a food truck that's sitting outside your favorite stadium. You can go to the French Laundry. Pick your place. The experience can be incredible at each of those places. And so it's like, it's difficult. It's the same as the word taste to me, where it's like nailing it down is incredibly hard because it's this nebulous, shapeless, individualized, subjective thing. But I think any of those examples that I laid out, if all of us could probably kind of like list off a couple of things, if we were to put a whiteboard behind us right now, we could list out, okay, we just got out of the sports game and we go up to a food truck. What would a great experience look like at one of these places? The founders of Airbnb actually did this. If anybody wants to do this exercise for their business, it's called the 11-star experience exercise. You can research this after the show today. And it's basically that. You're listing off what are the things that are present, what elements make up a great experience at one of these places. And any business owner should be taking a look at any of those things and implementing them yesterday. Because if you have the ability to articulate them, and more importantly, can you operationalize them, get your staff to care about them, and consistently deliver them, it's almost like the problems you're talking about from your business will go away. You know what I mean? They will be a thing of the past because you focused on the right thing instead of, what you were basically sharing, which is like these things on Instagram where it's like, I found this cool recipe on Granda and now I'm, going to decide to implement that into my tasting menu and look at how cool it looks. But everybody tastes it and they're just kind of like, nah, not so memorable.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, that app has really great ideas.
Yes.
And of course you can tweak them to your
totally.
liking. And so, man, there's so much I want to get into with you.
Please. We can keep going. I can go for another half hour if that's cool with you. Yeah,
Okay.
Both my son and I were supposed to have a doctor's appointment, and both of our doctors canceled on us this morning. I don't know what happened with that clinic, but I would have had to have left a little bit earlier, but I have the time, so let's keep going.
All right, awesome. Let's see. I have a whole list of questions.
Sure. Yeah.
I'm just like picking and choosing.
Yeah.
Because I really do want to do a part 2 to this.
Yeah.
And I'm loving this conversation, and I'm loving your insight on all of this, not just the restaurant and your experience, but also the entrepreneurship. Because
Totally.
the private chefs who are listening to this, they're going to gain so much. I'm gaining a lot of this because, again, you've been in this game longer than I have. I recently became a private chef maybe 2-3 years ago. So I want to get into personal and thought-provoking questions for you.
Sure.
If you could go back in time and give your younger self one sentence of advice, what would it be?
Do you have a preference in my restaurant time, maybe? Would that be the most helpful for the listener? Or is there, like another
Let's do
angle I could approach
one
this?
restaurant,
Uh-huh.
and then let's go another one where you talk about business, right? Because the way, because again, I'm young to the private chef industry, so I want to go. So let's do one for chefs and one for business.
I think on the restaurant side, this is so hard, man, because like on one hand, it really helped me, but on the other hand, I saw where I maybe I beat myself up a little bit too much on this, which is the chasing of the stars at a young age. And where this came from for me was a lot of chefs who had this happen to them will be able to empathize here, is you read Marco Pierre White and the age that he was able to achieve 3 Michelin stars. And I can't remember exactly what the age is, but I was doing the math when I read that at age 19. And I basically reverse engineered it. And I said, I got this. I'm going to beat him. I'm going to be the youngest 3 Michelin starred chef in the world. And I didn't talk about that when I shared 3 Michelin starred restaurant in Chicago. It had this almost like little tag along friend that was by age 27 or whatever that happens to be. And I think looking back, it gave me an immense sense of urgency when it came to my career. Again, I shared already some of those benefits of not being distracted, being able to focus, being able to confidently make decisions because I knew the things that I was doing was getting me closer to that goal. But I think as I started to get closer to that age and I looked at myself and I was kind of like, well, you're probably not going to hit this goal. I beat myself up a lot around that as a achievement. And looking back at that, I think like I laugh at it now because it's like, dude, what would you have done at 27 with 3 Michelin stars? Like what comes after that? And I think I'm so glad that I kind of like was able to discard it or just hang it up on the wall and say, thanks for the motivation, but I'm going to move beyond this, at least for right now, because I think it would have required a level of sacrifice, whether in my health or my relationships or burn bridges or hurting people along the way, that I wasn't willing to compromise on. And so it's that tension that you've mentioned Gary Vee before. He talks a lot about like patience in the macro, but urgency in the micro, speed in the micro. And I think there's a little bit of that I like. I wouldn't change. I would just more go back to that person and ask the thoughtful question of what happens after you do that? What does that allow you to do that you couldn't do if you got 3 Michelin stars when you're 35, 45, 55? Like if the goal is to, if that's really the end goal, unless you're going to talk about, you know, like we look at all these chefs who kind of like, they get the stars and then they just kind of like, then it's the TV show, then it's the cookbook, then it's the judging on, you know, competitions. Maybe it's opening more restaurants, right? It's just kind of like, is that actually an end state where you will, you know, kind of like be able to finally sit and sit in that? And to be honest, like really getting vulnerable here, I think the reason I wanted to push for those things is because I wanted to prove people wrong. Like I really wanted some of the chefs who told me I wasn't good enough or doubted me or roasted me during service. I wanted that achievement to be able to finally point to them and say, I told you. You know what I mean? Like, F you for doubting me. Do you know what I mean? Because I was actually able to accomplish this thing at a really young age. Because how often does that happen too? We just saw it, I think it was last week, some 18-year-old or 19-year-old kid has the world record indoor mile time. Because the second that I do it, it's going to light a fire under some other kid's butt. And then he's going to come along, she's going to come along and dethrone my achievement. And then how am I going to feel if I spent, 7 or 8 years making that my identity, that the thing I was going after? And so to summarize, it's like, if there is an underlying reason, like a genuine underlying reason behind, if I can achieve this thing, it will allow me to blank, keep going, like run with it. But if you probe 1 or 2 layers deeper, or you realize that there are trade-offs that you're going to need to make that either don't resonate with your values or you're going to regret in the future, I would just hazard against really keeping those as the priority. You can use them for individual points in time. I think that like fuel, whether it's through, people doubting you or again, wanting to prove something. There's a great investor named Josh Wolf who says, chips on shoulders, put chips in pockets. And I love that analogy because it's like the person who has a chip on their shoulder is going to work harder. They have a deeper motivation than everybody else. And that can be really outstanding fuel to allow you to push through, to outlast somebody, to think about problems in a different way, to prioritize growth, maybe in some way, shape, or form. But when it isn't tethered to anything actually real, it can be kind of a negative motivator. So that's the first thing. On the entrepreneurship side, if I could go back, I thought I did a good job of this, but looking back, I could have done better, which is actually thinking about monetization in a more thoughtful way. And so in my early days of YouTube, the meta of YouTube, if you will, was all around free content. I think in a lot of ways it still kind of is. Because if you're going to especially try to go mass market, most people don't want to be sold things through content. I think that is changing slightly as you start to see YouTubers selling their own products as opposed to taking sponsorships, and we can talk about that if you want. But I approached it in the early days of my YouTube channel as basically not ever wanting to cut off my audience from ever hearing the words, I'm going to charge you money. And so I think I launched a Patreon way too early. It was at like 700 subscribers or something like that. I launched a Patreon. Most people wait until they're at least like 5,000 or 1,000 or 10,000 subscribers before they launch a Patreon. But I told myself, I was like, I don't want to run into that problem. I don't want to have this issue of not being able to monetize my audience. And that was beneficial from the sense of that belief allowed me to ask for money sooner than most YouTubers did. But in the long run, the feedback I got when I had 700 subscribers and I launched my Patreon and 2 people signed up, it basically provided this thing on, okay, monetization is bad. And then you start to see other people talking about like, again, like I will sing Gary Vee's praises to the moon and back, but he does have this element of kind of like, I have this other business that makes me money because I'm the chairman and CEO of VaynerMedia. And so all my content is free. And that really negatively affected me because I was like, oh man, it cast doubt in my mind. I was like, maybe I shouldn't be charging for my stuff. Maybe I shouldn't be asking for money. Maybe I should not be taking sponsors on my videos. And that led me to this really negative place on the content side, which ultimately, again, talking about lessons and the things that it actually taught me, it made it so that I had the confidence to launch Repertoire as an education company. Because I got to this place where I'm like, man, like across all my platforms, I have 50,000 followers, but I've gotten to this place where I'm so uncomfortable monetizing this audience. And in a way, I've trained them that they're able to get insights from me for free. You know what I mean? I'm providing value, provide value. It turned into this really toxic, kind of like relationship that I had with my business where I was almost ashamed or too nervous, or I would couch asking for money with almost like an apology of like, it's okay if you can't pay for this right now, or it's okay if blah, 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 blah. When in reality, I wish I would have been, because on the event side, as I talked about with pricing your dinners, I have so much comfort in charging a client, what I need to charge for, a dinner. But when it came to the content side, it was like that negatively affected my ability to, again, be profitable. And then that trickle down made it so that I wasn't able to upload as frequently. You know what I mean? I had short-term behavior that I had to execute on because I was like, man, I've really been wanting to say no to sponsors, but this sponsor just came to me with this thing and my channel hasn't really made that much money over the past 3 months. So maybe I should just say yes to this sponsorship. And so just the lesson there for me is kind of like making sure that making profit is prioritized as a skill. Like I truly think it's a skill because what's underneath that? Your ability to negotiate, the type of market you're going after, your ability to craft an offer, pricing psychology. You can get better at all of those things that will make your business a little bit more profitable as you start to grow, as you start to get more exposure, as you ultimately build an audience. And so all of that layered on top of one another is like, if I had to go back, I just wish I would have done that. It's something that is like a huge focus for me going into this year. And it's one of those funny things where I almost have to unwind some of those beliefs where it's like, I look at, maybe I'm only uploading 2 videos a month, but it's like, if I'm making 5x more revenue, it's kind of like, isn't that a win? You know what I mean? And I have to, again, rework a little bit of that psychology in myself because prior to my son being born, like 2 years ago when I was putting out content, I would look at like, oh my goodness, we had this video on TikTok do 2 million views. And it's like, it didn't lead to any more business. And it's like, well, yeah, dumbass. It's because you didn't set up your business in a way to actually capitalize and convert on those eyeballs that you were getting on those videos. Like, why would people give you money? And so again, it's like, it's a little bit of that, like, you still take the personal responsibility. You still point the finger at yourself, but it's like you take some of those lessons. And I guess I wish somebody would have gone back and like, I was so high on getting views. Like I just wanted to, because that becomes a negative spiral too. I didn't know why that video got 2 million views. But it's kind of like that sets the benchmark, that sets the baseline. And it's like, it's very difficult to recreate those viral moments. And to be honest, the people who do chase after those viral moments aren't the people that I look up to when it comes to content creation. It's not to say that that's bad. I think certain people are incredibly good, way better than I am at going viral. But when I look at the business that I want to have, I just wish I would have made that association sooner.
Those both of those are very good advices that I think even I would, put into myself. And I did make that mistake where I tried to monetize my Instagram page a little too quick and it didn't really lead to anything. And so, I mean, I immediately took it down. But I was like, nah, this is not, a part of me too was like, I'm not giving them the value that they are paying for. And I think I was only charging 99 cents or no, less than that. I think it was like 50 cents a month or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm just like, it still like it's 50 cents, and ethically I want to do things the right way. And if I don't have the time, because I'm now running the podcast, I'm running pop-ups now, I'm doing catering events, private chef events, going to school, I'm doing all of these things where it's like, okay, well, now I need to learn how to edit my videos for cooking, and I can't be hiring a videographer to do these edits for $1,000 or whatever it is, because it's not just $1,000 that you're paying for with the video, you're also paying for the food, you're also paying for your gas, the light,
your time. You know what I mean? Like like a traditional video production studio would line item your time as talent time.
Right.
And you're getting paid to be on camera and host the thing and provide direction on and script the video. You know what I mean? Like all of that time gets accounted for. Like I'm so glad you brought up that example of the 50-cent membership thing, because my Patreon in the early days was, I think my first tier was $2 a month. And then I led into $10 a month. And then I think I had a $50 a month tier. And I guess I wish I would go back and tell that, younger version of Justin, kick out that $1 a month tier, man. Because it's like, if you're really honest with yourself, how much better of an experience could you provide for $50 a month to those people who are subscribing to you? Where we look at some of these pricing things and the private chef thing and the content creator thing, like they're different industries, but they suffer from the same problems, which is the private chef who is charging $30 a person to go cook at somebody's house. And they're going to sit on this call with us and they're going to say, chefs, I'm not making money on any of my dinners, or like, I feel so, like overextended when it comes to my stuff. And you and I would both look at that person and just be like, you're charging $30 a person and you're doing a 3-course, meal. There's no way you're going to make that work. And so we look at that in the private chef side and that totally makes sense. But then we look at it as like you and I both charging $1 a month to subscribe to our content. And I promise I'm going to provide value to you. And then you do some of these like, for all intents and purposes, fake calculations in your head. It's like, yeah, but if I got 1,000 people to sign up for this thing, it's like, you need to do the more reasonable calculations on 1% of your audience is probably going to sign up for this. So if you have 10,000 followers, it's like, you're going to get 100 people to sign up for this thing. It's nothing. And so it's like, that turns into something where, can you really make this work on $100 a month? And the answer is going to be no. And so what you're better off doing, and the other funny thing about that is like the $30 per person for a 3-course menu is so funny, because when you're nervous about pricing, you overcompensate by trying to do more to try to make up the thing so that it is almost like a no-brainer offer, or like it's almost like you're over-delivering in that way. And anytime that you're doing that, you're not actually following the business principles of like building profit into whatever it is that you're doing. Because if we were to look at, like pick a water bottle or a microphone, like it totally makes sense for you and I to look at this microphone and say, this retails for $150 and it probably cost them $60 to make this microphone. And you and I look at that and you're like, yeah, that makes sense. They got to build in profit. They got to take their materials costs. They got to pay for marketing. There's packaging, there's shipping, there's all these sorts of things that they need. They needed to hire a graphic designer to put together the, whatever. But it's like, we look at our business and we're kind of like, you don't do that same math. Like the advice doesn't apply to you for some reason. And so, yeah, going backwards in there, I'd be like, charge $30 a month per person and really just kind of like make that something where you're actually coming out ahead. And it's like, if you can do that, it ultimately makes it so that you will find success faster and you will actually be fulfilled when you hit the success. More so than, like you set the price low and you say it's a screaming deal and you're down on your hands and knees and you're begging your audience to sign up for this thing. And then you ultimately know that you can't either deliver an experience for them. Again, it comes back to my experience analogy.
Not sure if you've ever heard of him, but Andy Frisella.
Yeah, of course.
I love his back when he was doing the MFCEO project.
Sure. Yeah.
Which is I'm still waiting for him to do that again. He mentions always over deliver and under promise.
Yes.
And so I guess the whole $30 example that you're making right now, do you think people might kind of skew the over deliver and under promise, but then so essentially you're over delivering but undercharging? How would you go about that?
Doing that 11-star experience exercise is incredibly helpful. For one. For two, and basically to summarize for somebody, you're basically most people cap their business at a 5-star review. And this exercise gets you to outline what a 6-star, 7-star, 8-star, 9-star, 10-star, and 11-star experience looks like for your business. And then the way that you kind of like reverse engineer from there is like, maybe you decide that like, okay, well, 11 stars is ridiculous, because I think in the exercise they talk about like, you get a helicopter to fly you to your Airbnb, and when you get there, your favorite band is playing a patio concert for you when you get there. It's just it really forces you to dream big. And so maybe you decide that's not the case, but it's maybe you decide, okay, maybe a 7-star experience compared to our current 5-star experience. There's a sweet spot there. And then you as the business owner, you're in charge of arbitraging that discrepancy. And so can I deliver a 7-star experience, which is, in the market is valued at this, it's valued at $300, but it only costs me $100 to fulfill this. Interesting. So that spread I can ultimately make on, do you know what I mean? Whatever it is that I'm providing to the market. And so that's number one. The other one that's pretty helpful here is kind of like the order of magnitude exercise. And so you take whatever it is that you're charging, $30 a month, let's say. If I had to charge $300 a month to the current customer base that I'm going after, what would that look like? What would need to be true in order for me to confidently make a post about, hey guys, I'm doing a $300 a month subscription here? And what you'll often find is maybe there's a world where I can layer on one or two things, and it doesn't always have to be the same thing. Talking about things I've learned in entrepreneurship. In the early days, it was always access to me. More access to me was the thing that I was selling. And what I came to realize was that ultimately runs out because there's only 24 hours in a day, and I can only be on so many phone calls. And so then you say, okay, well, maybe it's not one-on-one access to me. Maybe they're group sessions. Maybe there's like, maybe it's not every single Monday. I am a part of a great entrepreneur community on the internet. I pay $2,000 a year to be a part of this community. And the founder of that community does scheduled hot seat calls. It's an incredible way to structure his business, because he doesn't say, I'm going to be the monkey that jumps on camera every Monday at 2 p.m. He says, if you want a hot seat call with me, I will give you the advice, but you need to fill out this thing that tells me exactly what it is that you're working on. And we need to book in time that's going to work for my schedule. interesting. Now you're structuring it in a way where you're not feeling overextended and overburdened by the thing that you promised. And so it's almost to your point, you can move the expectation of the person, but then you can also move your, deliverance in a way that aligns with how you want to run your business. You can also talk about like asynchronous support that you provide to people. Maybe you make a big video library of the things that you frequently talk about, the questions you get asked all the time, and then that actually scales. That's doing leverage, basically. You're creating content that allows you to scale your time so that you record a video once, but it can be watched hundreds and thousands of times by the people that come into your thing. Maybe there's a way you can layer on other offers. I have a great friend. His name is Miles. He runs a program called 80/20 Cooking. And he, just this week on Twitter, he did it in public. It was fascinating to watch. He was basically like, my program is $300. It's a at-home, become a better home cook, type of program. I'm going to basically teach you how to cook without recipes. But he reached out to some of his favorite brands in the home cook space, his favorite sea salt company. He talks to Maiden for pots and pans, his favorite knife company. And he got discounts from every single one of those knife company brands, where it's like in aggregate, when you combine all the offers together, if you were to buy all the things that Miles cooks with at home, it pays for the membership to the course. Like it pays for your enrollment into the thing. All these fascinating things that you can learn about when it comes to monetization that you can layer onto your offer, that again is not more access to you. And so I think that's a fascinating way to kind of approach monetizing stuff. Very similar to like private chef takeaways that I can share is kind of like, maybe there's a world where you can bring in a som to do wine pairing for your dinners. And that's an additional service that, again, you price it in a way where you're making the spread on if this person decides we're going to hire a som for this dinner. Okay, interesting. You know what I mean? We're gonna profit ultimately from that experience. And so, again, these are all things that like I needed to learn about the hard way when I stepped into the market with this thing that I thought was valuable, presented it in a way that was not quite confident or optimized or built to scale or profit, and face planted. And now I wish, again, like going back, there would be things that I would change it. So like just practically how I'm thinking about things, it's like very similar to the private chef clients. It's like now I'm only almost exclusively talking to business owners, because it's like the line cooks of the world, and I lived this life. Do you know what I mean? It's difficult to enroll in a program when you're basically living paycheck to paycheck. And so what I would much rather do is take an approach where I'm continuing to provide insights to them and maybe having some, conversations, or we have an email back and forth or whatever, we have a conversation over the DMs together, and I'm helping you in whatever way that I can. But when it comes to the people I'm actually, deciding to work with and monetize, maybe those are the people where I can take their business from, here to there. I can provide a transformation across their entire organization. Because if I'm really being honest, like that's where I nerd out anyways. That's where I feel like, again, I've hit that point on the mountain where I feel like I can help. And it's way easier to sell there too, right? Because it's like, I'm not doing the groveling, getting on my hands and knees and begging, hoping that these people will buy my thing. I can just draw a straight line from here's what I can do to here's the investment that's required, and you're going to see a return on this investment that you're making.
Awesome. Chef Justin, thank you so much for taking the time to sit here and speak with me. It's been a huge, huge honor. And again, thank you so much for everything you've done for my career. Even though this is the first time I'm speaking to you, this is, to me, a surreal moment because, again, like I mentioned earlier, you essentially put me in a route on the road to becoming who I am today, as a professional chef through your content on YouTube, and I'm so glad, and I'm extremely honored to have been able to speak to you and do this. Where can we find you?
Well, thank you for such gracious praise. I know that as we shared before, I think before the mic turned on, it's like the likes and the comments are one thing, but being able to actually connect with folks is like where I get a ton of value, and that's what it's all for. And kudos to you for putting in the work to actually bring a lot of this to life and doing continued work, like above and beyond. Like, you're not cooking at an event right now. You're putting out content to ultimately continue the helping of the next generation. And so just thank you for asking great questions and for hosting me and just being able to connect in this way. I absolutely want to do a part 2 if you'll have me back. My education company is called Repertoire. So it's joinrepertoire.com. We'll put it in the show notes if that's available. I'm available to search across almost every single platform on justinkhanna.com, and my YouTube channel will pop right up. Repertoire does a weekly newsletter as well as a podcast that I'm revamping for 2025. And I'm very excited for the content we're going to be putting out there. I offer a alternative to culinary school. It's a culinary program called Total Station Nomination, where I talk about the principles required to prepare, perform, and problem solve in professional kitchens. So if any of those insights around working in high caliber kitchens, behaving in the ways that executive chefs want to see resonates, I would love to have you in that program, because that's all my best content from those lessons distilled and presented in one place. You get a visual analysis of basically how you're performing on your station across 9 different measures, and I show you exactly where you can improve. And so I've done the work to kind of quantify a lot of this stuff that is sometimes arbitrary and hard to nail down. And other than that, I just like I keep my DMs open. You know what I mean? I love chatting with folks and getting insights. I know that that's sometimes where people are more comfortable sharing, is in a more private capacity. And so, yeah, I'd just be honored to speak with any of your listeners and help however I can.
Thank you so much, Chef.
Thank you.